just, eating food and leaving it. And, there was just so much waste and everything. Being out of your usual environment when you're not particularly used to that. Are you coping okay with being in the UK? Yeah? Do you know what culture shock feels like? A little bit? Yeah, okay. So when you're in a different place and in a different setting, in a different context, it can be an overwhelming experience, especially if you're young. I think we can allow that John Mark could cope as far as Cyprus, but when he crossed over into what we know as Turkey, what then was described as Asia Minor, the region was Pamphylia, and he found himself in a whole new different world, largely amongst Gentile people, largely people who would have looked and talked and dressed differently from what he knew. It was already a stretch, I think, for him to go from Jerusalem to the arguably a bit of Cyprus that he'd never been to before, but now he's even further. Paul describes John Mark as deserting them. Barnabas was much kinder and wanted to give the boy another chance later on and take him with him. And so we're told that John went back. Now, it's not the main point of this passage, and there's a long passage, and so I just want to touch on certain points. But I do want to draw to your attention the fact that, all of us at one time or another may have or have had a wobble. A wobble in our faith, a wobble in our psyche and our emotions, a wobble in our stability or our mental well-being, ability to cope in a new or different situation and circumstance. And John Mark went back home. He retreated to a place of safety, went back to Jerusalem. His mother's house was there where the church met in Jerusalem. And I wonder how John Mark felt. If you were John Mark and you came back and you then had to make all of that reverse journey all the way home on your own. I imagine for John Mark it was a difficult season. Licking his wounds, feeling like a failure, feeling like he'd let Paul down, he'd let Barnabas down, he'd let God down, he'd let everybody down. And here he was going back to Jerusalem with his tail between his legs to tell the story of a missionary journey that he didn't complete, and he didn't know what they were doing now because he'd left. It can be very easy for us to talk ourselves into a horrible place and imagine that God must just be so angry with me because I'm a failure. Now, a lot of that is conjecture. We don't actually know, but we can piece together enough to imagine that that's a reasonable suggestion. And then we recognize that John Mark was the author, in all probability, of Mark's gospel. And that God had other plans and purposes. And that we read elsewhere in the epistles that Paul speaks fondly of John Mark and says, if he comes to you, welcome him. And their relationship was restored, and God had another plan and a purpose for Mark, and Mark authored a gospel. And so if Paul and Barnabas went to part of Asia Minor and were used to help plant the church there, how much bigger reach did the gospel of Mark have in terms of the worldwide church? What's the point? The point is that God can take what you might perceive as failure or disappointment, or things that you got wrong, or you lost your nerve, or that you didn't follow through, or you wandered off track, or whatever. There is nothing that, if put into the hands of Jesus, cannot be turned around and redeemed and made to work in some other way. If it hadn't been for John Mark's deserting Paul and Barnabas, which led to Paul and Barnabas parting company, then we possibly would never have heard of a guy called Silas. God is able to take our mistakes and our messes and turn them around. So let's think about Paul and Barnabas' mission. I asked you to think about what you do on day one in a new place. And of course, understandably and correctly, you imagined, this is a holiday trip and I'm going out to sightsee in a new destination and find my way around a town. But how would it be if you were substituted in for John Mark? Supposing they said, okay, John Mark, you go back to Jerusalem. Frankie, you're on. John, Hazel, you're on. Colin, you're on. Come and join the team. Isabella, you're now part of the team. You're now part of the team that is going into a new territory, that's going into a place where the gospel's never been taken before. What would you do? That's a rhetorical question. I'm not going to ask you to have another table talk. But how would you go about it if you were going into some new place where you had never been before and you didn't know the situation? Well, you're going into a new week that you've never been in before and you don't know what's going to happen in it. None of us does. None of us does. There's some people at the end of this week licking their wounds because the budget will have made a big difference to their finances, maybe even the viability of their business. If they're an employer and they can't cope with the increase in employers' national insurance, for example. Every time there's a budget, the financial, fiscal sands shift a little bit. And so for some people, from last week to this, there's an anxiety and an uncertainty that wasn't there a week ago. This coming week, there's an election in the United States, and we all know what a tinderbox that situation is. And we know how easily and sadly how readily things could go horribly wrong depending on how the election goes and how it's perceived and whether there's cries of foul on either side of the debate when the election comes and everybody's claiming that because the person they wanted didn't get in, then the thing was rigged. A week can make a difference. You're going into a week that you don't know already. How are you going to go into it in Jesus' name? What was Paul and Barnabas' missionary pattern then? Let's just briefly take a look at the broad picture. So where did they go? First of all, they went to the synagogue. They started with what they knew. They started with what they knew. They went to the people who were their own people. Because wherever they were, the familiar place would be to go there. Now, for Brandon, the familiar place would be to go to Starbucks, and he would start in Starbucks. I'm not sure what Starbucks was called in Perga in those days, but there was doubtless an equivalent. Where would you go? Where are the known and usual and familiar places that you go? It might be your work. It might be the place where you study. It might be the people that you're normally with. It might be that the normal place for you to go is a class or something that you're regularly part of. And so Paul went first to the people